Hello and welcome to Political Business. I'm Nathan Parsad-Wyatt, former Conservative Party candidate and advisor.
And I'm Kevin McKeever, a one-time Labour parliamentary candidate, staffer and advisor to some of Britain's biggest brands.
We've both stood for elections, we both advised on how to win elections, and our advice continues here on this podcast as the landscape around politics shifts. Whether politically, economically, socially or technologically, old approaches no longer cut through. Welcome to Political Business. On today's episode, no conference bounce for either party, what's changing inside Number 10, and are the grown-ups finally back? London's housing starts collapse, new data from Mollior paints a stark picture of where the market's heading, and the by-election map, reform everywhere, and what that means for the big political parties. So the first two episodes, we came to you from Labour and then Conservative Party conferences. Now the dust settled, the hangovers are over. Everybody's going through their receipts and having arguments with their finance departments and their bosses. But what is the post-conference mood in Westminster and, more importantly, the country? Well, when all's said and done, when all the leaders have sat down from their landmark speeches, when all the roller banners have been rolled up and hit people in the ankles on the trains back to London, the polls show not much of a difference. Just today, the YouGov poll, this week shows Reform on 27, Labour on 20, which is pretty much on move from YouGov in the last couple of weeks, the Tories on 17, the Lib Dems on 16, and the Greens on 13. In fact, the Greens are the only ones to get a post-conference bounce. So what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that despite all our analysis, actually, the party conferences haven't really hit the public or cut through in the public consciousness. And why is that? Well, it's probably because, as we'll discuss in future weeks, actually most people are concerned about the cost of living. They're concerned about their job security. And most people, and businesses in particular, are thinking about the budget. Lots of budget speculation. We're not going to talk about that today. Post-conference and over-conference, there were some pretty important moves in Number 10 on the policy side. Not least the departure of two long-time Keir Starmer advisors, in fact, some of whom were with Keir in opposition, not least environmental spad Caris Roberts, and also the equalities and culture spad Marina Lula, which I think is particularly significant because she managed to steer Keir Starmer through quite a few potentially difficult policy areas with the Labour Party and then with the country. What does their departure mean? Well, it's been said by some that this is perhaps the government, Number 10 in particular, getting a bit sharper. Is it a move to the right? Is it a move from, equality? Those that supported Starmer in opposition perhaps aren't quite up to it in government. Depending on what side of the Labour Party you're on, will determine what your view is. But also the departure of Steph Driver, I know we've talked about this, Nathan, hasn't gone down too well. She was Keir Starmer's comms director, again in opposition, very well respected and liked by the lobby. She left just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, just I think after conference. And I'm told Morgan McSweeney and the Prime Minister himself tried to get her to stay. So summer briefing, the grown-ups are back in charge in the policy unit in Number 10. I think that remains to be seen, but certainly when it comes to business engagement, those key policy advisors inside Downing Street have changed and they've been swapped for people, arguably, with a much higher and longer-standing public profile.
It's a bit Westminster insidery, isn't it? But it is a good point. I think some of these internal changes are in some ways more important than the day-to-day cut and thrust of politics and going back and forth. Both conferences, I think, both Conservative and Labour conferences, I should say, were slightly strange this year, I think, because the whole thing was more about internal party management than it was about necessarily shifting the dial and a message to the country. So both party leaders went in with a bit of a target on their back. These internal changes are reflected actually on the Conservative side as well. I mean, Kemi Badenoch's top team has had a bit of a shake-up recently. People coming in, some long-standing people who have been involved in previous campaigns, some during the Cameron era. A chap called Stephen Gilbert, who was David Cameron's chief sort of campaign guy throughout the more successful years of the party. He is back advising Kemi Badenoch, I'm told, along with some other sort of old hands if you like, to steady the ship. And I think, from that point of view, there is a bit more consistency coming from the Conservative side. But similarly, those same old hands are now back in charge on the Labour side. So what is it? Is it a return to the sort of the 90s and early 2000s, Kevin? Do you think many more faces to make a comeback? Are we just going back in time?
I could tell you who won't be coming back. Probably Peter Mandelson doesn't have another life in him in politics, but
you never know.
He's managed to confound critics before, the man he is. I think, look, that there's certainly a briefing, but also I think a take as well from lots of people in Westminster, not least the Parliamentary Labour Party, is that it feels like the grown-ups are back in charge. And whether grown-ups means getting the old band back together from the 90s and noughties, again, depends on your point of view. But it's fair to say, I think, as well, on the Labour side, we talked about policy changes in the policy unit, but actually the comms changes do seem to be working, and not least Tim Allen's arrival in number 10, which some people was speculated whether he'd been out of the number 10, the politics game too long. He'd made his money in public relations, known closely to me. I worked with him for 5 years. And actually, I was just talking to a senior cabinet minister yesterday who said that his presence in the room is really valued. It's like he's got nothing to prove. He's made his money. He's done his time before, and actually he can give a good grown-up advice, and particularly that's working well in combination with Darren Jones and other key actors in Downing Street, such as Vidya Alexon, Deputy Chief of Staff, but also with Morgan McSweeney as well. So there's a sense that perhaps it's calming down a bit in number 10 after a few weeks or months of turbulence, and I think that's got to be good for Keir Starmer. It's got to be good for the Labour Party, and ultimately it's got to be good for the country in that respect. There is, of course, the Labour deputy leadership election happening at the moment, and the mood amongst MPs, if not the membership, is that it's beginning to get a little bit toxic. And toxic is the word that was used to me by a couple of MPs with glasses of wine in their hand last night, who said that perhaps the gloves had come off and actually they just wanted it now to go away.
It does feel that for all the changes at number 10, all of these problems are still sitting in the background, and all eyes still on the budget, which we'll return to in future episodes. Some stability perhaps in the short term. No point in anyone making any changes before the end of November. We've got that endless week-by-week drip feed of potential speculation on tax rises. You can say one thing one day, one thing another day. I think the truth is they're still writing the budget, aren't they, within the constraints of the fiscal envelope they've been given. So more to come on that.
Well, indeed. And of course, the envelope keeps changing. We've had changes in growth forecasts from the IMF. We've had changes in tax take from the ONS here in the UK. So you wouldn't want to be a policymaker at the moment. I wouldn't want to be in the Treasury right now. So not only does the size and the duration of the fiscal gap keep moving, but also therefore the value of potential tax rises and also the scoring of potential policy wins keeps moving. There are multiple moving parts. I'm sure that's keeping the Treasury team up at night and certainly keeping Torsten Bell very busy with that pen he's holding. What are people focusing on, as Parliament comes back, and budget aside? Obviously that's huge, and notwithstanding the great moment in the Middle East, which the juries, several American politicians seem to be at odds on the UK's role in that, but we'll leave that for other people to talk about. But look at actually what's happening this week when it comes to the housing market and the development market. There's been in particular over the past year a drip feed of quarterly results from Mollior, which is an insights company operating, and they released quarterly insights on housing starts in London in particular. So it's London we're talking about here. We can talk about why London's unique from the rest of the country in a minute. But it shows, Nathan, what?
Well, it shows that there are just 40,000 homes under construction, down from 60 to 65,000 between 2015 and 2020. And the news gets slightly worse in that 5,000 of those sites have already stalled. And effectively, their report says that no buyers means no new construction, and sales are collapsing across every price point. They said there were only 6,000 homes sold in the first 3 quarters of 2025. And here's the kicker. At the price levels most Londoners can afford, which they say is under £600 per square foot, individual buyers have virtually disappeared. So this is a problem across virtually every part of the residential market. The build-to-rent boom has run its course. They also flag that higher interest rates and the fallout from the Truss mini-budget has essentially frozen new investment, meaning that after 2027, completions will plunge. And that's actually potentially going to leave the rental market short of supply and push rents even higher at a time where people can scarcely afford an increase in rent. So in short, they say developers are stuck. Prices need to fall to restart those sales, but construction costs, planning obligations make that virtually impossible. So as a result, there are 280,000 homes that already have planning permission. That's a figure that we've heard many, many times before, but they remain unbuilt, and half of those are in areas where it's no longer financially viable to build at all. So they say that effectively by 27, only 15 to 20,000 homes will be under construction, and that's just a fraction of what London needs. So that's the picture. Demand collapsing, costs soaring, and policy still pulling in different directions. I think this was discussed quite a lot at Labour Party conference around the London set. The London Real Estate Forum was another gathering of the great and the good of London in this sector, came together just a few weeks before that, and everyone was talking about it then. So I think there is an understanding from the policymakers that this is a problem.
The Treasury in particular is looking at this data and is very concerned. You remember, of course, that Rachel Reeves made great play earlier in the year and in the last budget of getting the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, to score, i.e. price in the outcome of planning reform. And in fact, the OBR did indeed do that. So they're going back and looking again. So the Treasury is saying, what can we do to get planning moving? In particular, they're going to bring forward a second planning bill, which is going to deal with infrastructure issues, because these big ticket items are still difficult to get over the line and get spades in the ground. But of course, the first planning and infrastructure bill is not even through Parliament, and it goes back to the Lords, I think, next week. And it's reported, or not reported, the chatter is that Steve Reed, the new Secretary of State, famous for his build, baby, build mantra, is looking for a few specific measures to help when it comes to the planning side as soon as they get that bill across the line onto the statute books. So one of the new measures which will come forward in terms of a government amendment in the Lords is that they'll stop councils refusing a planning application whilst the government considers whether or not it's going to call it in. Remember, government has the power to recover, to call in and take the power away from local authorities and decide planning applications for themselves. And obviously, it doesn't have an infinite capacity to do that. Local government should be making the right decisions. This is a highly targeted power, particularly for a high volume residential scheme. So the government will introduce a clause in the bill which will stop local authorities from refusing an application if the Secretary of State is minded to call it in and determine it. So that will help. Not only the formal power, of course, but the fact government has that power means that local authorities will think twice about refusing an application if there's indications that central government's interested. So there's a kind of a positive impact even without using the power. The second is, one, there's already a move to stop the scope of judicial reviews of planning consents, but also whilst that's being enacted and works its way through, and no doubt itself will be subject to judicial review, the government wants to introduce a clause which will stop the clock once the judicial review or any other interruption in the planning process is exercised. So if you get a planning consent, a group then raises the money to launch a judicial review, the clock on the expiry of that planning consent will stop. It's actually quite a lot of schemes. One, initially accidentally, were being what you call timed out. They weren't able to build out the planning consent, and then the clock runs out. And actually, some groups have been wise to that in recent years and been using things like judicial review proceedings to time out an application without even having to follow through on the JR. So that's something that the department is looking to recover to a power looking to introduce via the Lords stage of the planning infrastructure bill. And then probably the other measure that I think is quite interesting is Natural England have to respond to all consultations put out by a local authority, statutory consultees. And what that means is lots of applications get held up waiting for Natural England to respond. The government wants to reduce the burden on Natural England by removing the necessity for them to respond on planning applications where they've already provided guidance. So three kind of really practical measures to get things moving pretty quickly. And these have to be off the statute books and implemented pretty fast to make any difference. Because obviously this we're going to be at the halfway point of Parliament soon. So the time for these to impact, the clock's running out. And once all that's done, and once the second planning and infrastructure bill, or the infrastructure bill is introduced to help with big infrastructure schemes, then of course the Treasury will want to go to the OBR probably in time for next year's budget in order to get them to score the potential growth element of that, and therefore provide that much needed extra fiscal headroom, which Rachel Reeves so dearly wants.
At Loic Hedry, we help our clients make sense of a complex world and get things done. Whether it's shaping policy, delivering major projects, or managing your reputation, we bring together deep experience and fresh thinking to get results that matter.
And now you hear it every week on our podcast. Subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you get your podcast. And we'll drop into your feed every week.
Do you think any of it's radical enough to really shift the dial in London? It seems to me that we're dealing with a market that is obviously always on lag because the consequences of today reflect the conditions of a couple of years ago. Do you get a sense that the Treasury in particular understands that? I'm sure that London decision makers do, but maybe having a London MP, Steve Reed, now in that position, he probably understands it a little bit more. What do you think about that?
I think certainly in terms of tweaks to the process, having Steve in the job is really helpful. You can see the influence of a former local government leader in London in some of these amendments that are being proposed to the Lords next week. But I think they are tweaks. Now, you and I were at dinner a couple of weeks ago where with a leading London politician and some representatives of the development sector, and one of our wonderful American clients gave the perspective of what happens in Manhattan when you want to develop an office building. And he said that due to the zoning laws over there, if you meet the basic envelope, the process is much faster, cheaper, and more importantly, much more certain than it is in London. Now, we can talk about London versus, a non-comparative place and say, well, London's very unique. It's got a long heritage. It's got, lots of considerations. But is anyone really telling us that London and Manhattan are fundamentally different in how we respect or care for our urban environment? I suspect not. So I think it's probably too late in the political cycle to introduce radical ideas. They probably need to be in a manifesto. But I think once again, we really need to see probably more radicalism when it comes to the planning process. What I will say, though, is a big chunk of the housing delivery numbers are going to be via new towns. The first 3 announced to be spades in the ground before the end of this Parliament. They will be delivered by development corporations with powers that derive from statute, and they will bypass the current planning process. Actually, there is that element that there's going to be large-scale delivery of housing now and into the future on the new towns model with development corporations. And perhaps what we can do and what the sector can do and local government can say, well, what is the best we can take from the new towns process to introduce into the wider planning system? I think that's something we should all be looking at in due course. And I would definitely urge developers to do so. It's getting that balance right between local input, a policy context which is sure across a borough, addressing the national and the local need for housing and other infrastructure delivery. Fundamentally in this country, London's got the demand and doesn't have the supply. The cost base, for reasons we know, is very high. The rest of the country has less of a demand and actually has the ability to build more houses. Other economic policy, AI growth zones, new towns, will deal with creating more economic generation elsewhere. And we saw projects such as the great potential scheme up in Teesworks for a mega centre, which will produce more capacity than any single site in the United States. But fundamentally, the economic driver today is London and the southeast. We've got to make sure it's got the housing to carry on that boom. Otherwise, the country's going to end up in real problems.
I do wonder whether Kemi Badenoch's idea of getting rid of stamp duty or reforming stamp duty in some way might get a gummed up market moving. One of the things the report talks about is the inability of people at all price points to shuffle around, and stamp duty's definitely got to play its part. But I'm not sensing there's any political pressure on the Labour leadership following Kemi Badenoch's flagship announcement last week. It's been interesting that economists left and right have broadly welcomed it as a bad tax. Just don't think anyone can agree on what the potential alternative should be.
I think that's exactly right. It's a bad tax, but it's a bit like the Churchill's view of democracy. It's the best one we've got on the options available. The challenge is, there is some suggestion, there's decent conversation amongst those who are pro-development in the Labour Party that stamp duty is probably wrong to tax the purchase, should be taxing the sale. But there is some evidence to show, based on stamp duty threshold holidays are introduced under the coalition, that it can be inflationary and just move the price point for housing. So fundamentally, we just need more supply. The fact is, this government's going to be introducing 2 planning and infrastructure bills in the first half of this parliament. And that's impressive in terms of pushing legislation through, but actually doesn't make a difference because that's just legislation. I think I'll say a final word on this and be slightly critical perhaps of, or issue a challenge to some of my Labour friends and colleagues in Parliament, is that when the Labour government, what a Labour Party wants to do something, it does it. An example that's given to me regularly in private is the Workers' Rights Bill that was pledged to be introduced in the first 100 days. It breached parliamentary protocol to do so. And in fact, the leader of the House at the time, on Lucy Powell, almost, they tried to block it, I'm told. But it was a manifesto commitment. It was introduced in 100 days. It got its way through Parliament, and it's happening. And I do wonder if that level of political firepower and support across the parliamentary party in number 10 and across the cabinet table was given to planning and infrastructure reform, then maybe things might be moving faster by now. But it might be being unfair.
And that leads us on to, to your point, you can achieve stuff when you put your mind to it and put everything behind it. But is the political pressure and impetus there for them to put everything behind it? You look at by-election results up and down the country. You look at the individual campaigns that are being run at lots of these by-elections, and they're all very anti-housing, anti-development, save our greenbelt, among other kinds of messages. So, and that's actually in many cases where Reform are performing quite strongly. I don't see them really talking about housing other than in the context that if we reduce the number of people in the country, perhaps we wouldn't need as many houses. That seems to be the Reform line on it, the numbers game. But I don't see any other real commentary from them about housing. And of course, whether we like it or not, Reform are largely shaping the policy agenda, both left and right at the moment. So maybe just talk through, Kevin, you've been watching by-election results recently with a beady eye to see what's happening. And there's been some quite interesting ones.
Yeah, so the general trend since the all-out elections the elections in May this year is Reform wins, mainly at the hands of Labour. I think they've lost 30 council seats since May. Labour have lost to Reform, but also the Conservatives have been losing seats too. But much more interesting for the future, and particularly, say, for the general election strategy and where the Labour Party and then the Conservative Party will go in terms of policy, is where the votes are going. So whilst Reform is winning the seats, actually, when you dig into the data, particularly, I'll talk to the Labour side, if you would, Nathan, talk to the Tory side.
Yeah.
What we're seeing is, yes, Reform are winning seats from Labour across the country, from the Midlands to the North East and the North West. But actually, where they're bleeding votes the most, i.e. what's taking the votes from Labour to allow Reform to win, is on the left, and it is, depending where you are in the country, the Greens or the Lib Dems, but particularly the Greens. So one by-election I looked at last week was in Corby, which is a marginal seat in Northamptonshire, a place I know very well. Labour won the seat last year. It was the Tories won it in 2010. So it basically goes with the governing party as a parliamentary constituency. Reform had won the seat in May. It's one of many places where the councillor then resigned because it didn't realise that being a councillor entailed doing something, having responsibility. So as a by-election, Reform won it on 38% of the vote, but actually Labour came in at 32%, but the Greens were on 18.9%. Now, 25 years ago, I was a young organiser in that constituency, and I think we would have had 3 Green voters across the whole town of Corby, never mind in one ward. So it's very clear, and I spoke to the organisers on the ground afterwards, including some HQ observers, which tells you how seriously Labour HQ are taking this, who said that it was abundantly clear that the votes we were losing was to the Greens and to a lesser extent the Liberal Democrats. Others elsewhere in the country say that, including in inner London. Of course, we've got London elections in May, and that's leading to, quite a strong debate within the Labour Party from Morgan McSweeney down about where Labour targets its attentions. Yes, shore up the interface with Reform, and we saw the Prime Minister do that, notably in his conference speech, but actually now's the time then to deal with the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, particularly the Greens, who Labour are bleeding votes to, and that's what could cost Labour parliamentary seats. So the Greens might not win the seat, but if they take as they've done here, 18% of votes away, then that's the difference between a Reform Member of Parliament and a Labour Member of Parliament. And I think it's pretty interesting. The reverse is kind of true for the Tories, isn't it, Nathan?
Absolutely. And we saw that at the general election last year, where effectively the Conservatives are hemorrhaging votes to Reform, and that delivered a lot of Labour MPs on a fairly small margin. But you look at a recent by-election last week up in Worcestershire, safe Conservative seat. A Conservative councillor resigns. Any other time would have been effectively a paper campaign where the Conservatives sailed to victory. Their vote share down 35%, Reform's up as a new entrant to 43%. So they're taking, Labour's vote share was down massively as well. Again, all gone to the Greens. But that Conservative vote moved straight over to Reform. So what you're seeing is Reform leading the debate, and they're leading it week after week by taking votes from the Conservatives. The Greens splitting that left-wing vote and allowing Reform to win seats all over the country. Interesting context ahead of next May. We've covered a lot of ground there, Kevin. What would you say are our 3 key takeaways for the week?
So I think the first one, particularly from a business perspective when it comes to politics, is keep an eye on those personality changes in number 10. We'll talk at a future date about special advisors. And if you don't have time to keep an eye on what's happening in number 10, then hire someone that does.
Preferably us.
I'll let you say it, not me. That's my first one.
On the second point, housing continues to dominate the agenda in London. You need to be part of that debate and shaping the debate in whatever way you can if we're to stand a chance at getting out of that mess.
And I think finally, the third takeaway is don't look at those local by-elections in isolation, but try and extrapolate what it means for not just the mood of the country, but the impact it has on the 2 traditional parties. I won't call them the major parties. What happens on a rainy Thursday in Corby could ultimately affect the direction of the Labour Party when it's repeated across the country.
Thanks for joining us on Political Business, where we give you our trusted advice in the changing landscape all around us.
To get more of what you've just heard, subscribe to the podcast and join us each week. Look us up online, as on LinkedIn, and find out more about what we do. Speak to you next week.
Bye now.